Today's video is going to be on music reading, basically the most simple notes and rhythm reading possible, mostly geared towards drummers, but anybody can use this as a basis for how to read music. So music is written typically on a staff, which is this group of 5 lines that I'm sure you've seen. Each staff is grouped into measures, so between the measure lines is one measure. So here we have 2 measures. The next thing you'll typically see on music is a time signature. So usually it'll be 4/4. It could be other numbers. The top number indicates how many beats. The bottom number indicates what kind of note we are talking about when we refer to beats. So in the case of 4/4, one measure has 1, 2, 3, 4 beats in it. This will be the standard measure that I'm talking about when I refer to the relative lengths of notes. A 4/4 measure containing 1, 2, 3, 4 beats. So here we have some of the basic notes. We'll start at the top left. The first one is a whole note. A whole note takes up the whole measure. So if you remember, that was 4 beats. So this whole note, you play it once and it lasts for 4 whole counts. Play, 2, 3, 4, then you can play again. The next smaller note is a half note. As the name suggests, it takes up half of a measure. So 1, 2, 3, 4, you'd have to play 2 half notes in that space. First one takes up 1 and 2, the second one would take up 3 and 4. What we're actually counting when we're counting 1, 2, 3, 4 is a quarter note. A quarter note takes up exactly 1 beat. Each count gets its own quarter note. An eighth note is even smaller. 8 of them fill up an entire measure, or they are 1/8 of a whole note. So we've run out of counts now. Eighth notes are kind of interesting. You count them 1 and 2 and. One thing about eighth notes that could be confusing is that sometimes they're not connected to each other, and sometimes they are. When the bar connects 2 notes like this, it is equal to 2 individual notes like this. Another thing that's confusing about any kind of note, the stem going down is exactly the same as the stem going up. Here we are back at our standard 4/4 measure. So if we start out with a whole note, it's pretty straightforward. That one note takes up the whole measure, all 4 beats. So if we go on from there, we can do half notes. 2 half notes takes up the entire measure because each one is a half. We can go further to quarter notes. Essentially the dots get filled in. Now each quarter note gets its own beat. We go further still, we can go to eighth notes. I've notated them a little bit strangely because in each set of eighth notes, one happens on the beat and the other happens in between. The way we account for that is we say the word and. And I use a plus sign to indicate the and. Each number gets a note, each and gets a note. So we call this the downbeat, this the upbeat. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. In addition to notes, we can also have what are called rests. Rests are just notes that don't make sound. They follow the same pattern. This is a whole rest. This is a half rest. A good way to remember this is if you were walking along, you could fall into this hole. This one looks like a hat. Hat also starts with H. This squiggly looking thing, quarter rest. This like hockey stick thing, upside down, eighth rest. So 4 beats of rest, 2 beats of rest, 1 beat of rest, half a beat of rest. Back in our standard 4/4 measure, 1, 2, 3, 4 beats, a whole rest takes up the whole thing. We could change this to 2 half rests, just like we could with notes. So that would be an entire measure of rest. We could further change this to 4 of those weird squiggly quarter rests. That would take up the entire measure. Or 8 of those funny looking eighth rests. So on and so forth. You get the idea. So here's a measure that you may actually see at some point in music. It's our standard 4/4 measure, 4 beats. But now there's different stuff in here. So let's just look at this really quick. The first thing, quarter note, takes up 1 beat, so we move on to beat 2. Eighth note takes up half a beat, so we next need to look at the and after 2. Also happens to be an eighth note. They're connected. That indicates that those are eighth notes. So that takes up enough. Moving on to beat 3, we have a rest. So that's taken up, it just doesn't make sound. Go to beat 4, also has a quarter note, and that's good. So we now have 1, 2, and 4. If we tapped this out, it would be 1, 2, and 4. So here's a slightly different example of a regular 4/4 measure. We have beat 1, quarter note, takes up 1 beat, so we go to beat 2. Eighth note again, so that's half a beat, and of 2, also an eighth note, so that's good. Another half of a beat gets us to beat 3. Now we have a half note. The half note takes up 2 beats, so this note also accounts for beat 4. We have to wait past beat 4, but there's nothing there. So if we tapped this one out, it would go 1, 2, and 3, 4. There'd be no tap on 4. We've already taken care of it on beat 3. Here are my main tips for helping you read music in the future. Tip number 1, count. If you just look at it and assume you know what it is, you'll normally be wrong. You have to actually count, sometimes out loud, and figure out what note is on what beat. Tip number 2 is go slow. If you've never done it before, and if you have the opportunity to work on it by yourself, go really, really slow. You can always speed it up later. Number 3, use a pencil. The way that I wrote in the 1, 2, and 3, 4 above that last example is the way that I really actually use a pencil on actual written music on paper to help myself if I can't figure out how it goes. Writing in pencil on music, even if it's not your music, is always okay, and it really will help you figure out what rhythms to play and when.